I think we agree that we are on 3.6.34, right? Ete varnasva dharmena Ete varnasva dharmena Yajanti svagurum harim Yajanti svagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhi artham Shraddhayatma vishuddhi artham Yajjata sahavrittibihi Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete varnasva dharmena Yajanti svagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhi artham Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete varnasva dharmena Yajanti svagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhi artham Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete varnasva dharmena Yajanti svagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhi artham Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete varnasva dharmena Yajanti svagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhyartham Yajjata sahavrittibihi. Ladies? Ete varnasva dharmena Yajanti svagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhyartham Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete varnasva dharmena Yajanti svagurum harim Shraddhayatma vishuddhyartham Yajjata sahavrittibihi Ete. All these. Varnaha, orders of society. Swadharmena, by one's own occupational duties. Yajanti, worship. Svagurum, with the spiritual master. Harim, the personality of Godhead. Shraddhaya, with faith and devotion. Atma, self. Vishuddhi artham, for purifying. Yat, from whom. Jata, born. Saha, along with. Vrittibihi, occupational duty. All these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the spiritual master. So, I say, and you please repeat, all these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the spiritual master. So here's Prabhupada's purport. Since they are born from different parts of the body of the Supreme Lord in his gigantic form, all living entities in all parts of the entire universe are supposed to be eternal servitors of the Supreme Body. Every part of our own body, such as the mouth, hands, thighs, and legs, is meant to render service to the whole. That is their constitutional position. In subhuman life, the living entities are not conscious of this constitutional position, but in human form of life, they're supposed to know this through the system of the Varnas and social orders. As above mentioned, the Brahmana is the spiritual master of all the orders of the society, and thus the Brahminical culture culminating in the transcendental service of the Lord is the basic principle for purifying the soul. In conditioned life, the soul is under the impression that he can become the Lord of the universe. And the last point of this misconception is to think oneself the supreme. The foolish conditioned soul does not take into account that the supreme cannot be conditioned by maya or illusion. If the supreme were to become conditioned by illusion, then where would be his supremacy? In that case, maya or illusion would be the supreme. Therefore, because the living entities are conditioned, they cannot be supreme. The actual position of the conditioned soul is explained in this verse. All conditioned souls are impure due to contact with the material energy in three modes of nature. Therefore, it is necessary that they purify themselves under the guidance of a bona fide spiritual master, who not only is a Brahmana by qualification, but also must be a Vaishnava. The only self-purifying process mentioned herein is to worship the Lord under the recognized method, under the guidance of a bona fide spiritual master. That is the natural way of purification, and no other method is recommended as bona fide. The other method of purification may be helpful to come to this stage of life. The other methods of purification may be helpful to come to this stage of life, but ultimately one has to come to this last point before he attains actual perfection. Bhagavad Gita confirms this truth as follows, 7:19. Bahunam janmanam ante gyanabanmam prapadyate vasudevim sabam iti sa mahatma sudurlabhaha. Ete varnasva dharmena yajanti svagurum harim shradayatma vishuddhi arthang yajajata sahavrittivihi. All these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme under the direction of the spiritual master. So let me again start this class by asking if anyone has any questions about anything we've been discussing or anything in this particular verse, just to see if anybody has an interest right off the bat. All right. Oh.
I mean, this always sticks out to me that, like, there's the different 8,400,000 species of life, and then, but it seems like Prabhupada says here, like, subhuman in the purport, but like, it seems like it would be like the same species. I don't know, does the Vedas define species in like a slightly different way, or at least, or like, is that just kind of like a
Well, right.
an insult or like an analogy or something like that? Or?
Right. The word that we use, species, has been defined in a very, very scientific, way, in a very specific way, and the Vedas use a different, word, and those two words are just kind of equivalized, even though actually they're quite different concepts in many ways. There's not a straight equivalent. They're a little bit different. So, today it seems like the main topic here is Varnashrama Dharma. Yesterday, Prahladananda Swami talked about the Shudras. That was the main focus of the verse. And the other day, Kavichandra explained about the various, from Bhagavad Gita in the 18th chapter about the various occupational duties of the Brahmanas and the, of course, the Vaishyas and the Shudras and the Kshatriyas. Okay, I'm not close enough to the mic. Okay, sorry about that. So these various 4 orders, and there's also 4 ashrams, so that's why it's called a Varna and Ashram, 4 ashrams and 4 Varnas. And these are more elaborately described in 7th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, in the 12th and 13th chapters of the 7th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, where Prahlad is speaking. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But one thing that we can focus on here, as the flow of this particular section of Bhagavatam, just to kind of get an overview of what's happening, Burijan does a very nice job of kind of putting these things in a nice overall framework, So we know that Vidura has approached Maitreya. He's asked him about the nature of creation. And then the first thing that Maitreya spoke of was how, the various expansions of the creation were done. And then we heard about demigods offering prayers. And now that was in chapter 5 of 3rd canto. Now we're in chapter 6. And we're coming kind of toward the end of chapter 6. And in this chapter, those same demigods that were offering prayers, we are now talking about how the Lord responded to them from verses 1 through 10, and then from 11 to this verse, 34, we hear about how the demigods enter in to the universe. So the demigods, at this point, we're only talking about a certain small subset of all the demigods we know, because the rest of the demigods are created much later on in the expansion that Brahma does when he creates the Prajapatis, and we talked about that last week. So at any rate, the demigods are expanded later on in something called the, what's it called again, the Daivam Shrotas, I think it is, or something like that. But at any rate, here we just have the demigods in charge of the senses entering into the 5 working senses, the 5 knowledge-acquiring senses, and the tanmatra. And this was what was kind of mysteriously described a little bit earlier as the Adhyatma, Adibhota, and Adidaivaka. So usually we hear Adibhotik, Adidaivik, and Adhyatmak as being the threefold miseries, which they are. Adidaivik being the miseries inflicted upon us by circumstances, or in other words, the demigods, drought, famine, disease, wars, those kind of things. That's usually called Adidaivik. And then we have Adibhotik, which is miseries inflicted by others, like people who are antagonistic to us, or insects or animals sometimes. So this is, miseries inflicted by others. And then there's Adhyatmic, miseries we inflict on ourselves, like worrying too much, eating too much, all those kind of things. And in this way we inflict certain miseries upon ourselves. Now, in this particular context, Adhyatmika and Adidaivika and Adibhotikam means something a little different. Here, the Adhyatmika is the living entities, and the Adidaivikam is these demigods that enter into material creation. And the Adibhotika is actually the senses themselves, or the material products. So this was described a few verses ago, about 10 or 15 verses ago or something like that. Now, this whole system of Varna Ashram, why does it exist? It exists because it's a organization of humans and demigods in such a way that humans can easily perform whatever they need to do to maintain their physical bodies, and at the same time they can do what's actually called for, which is to understand the nature of the Supreme and develop devotional service to the Supreme. So that's what the real purpose of the Varnashram system is. Now, the way it boils out in this particular part of Srimad Bhagavatam is that the demigods were asking with prayers in the last chapter, in chapter 5, the Supreme Lord to help them develop, to understand how they could work and do what they needed to do in the world, and at the same time not become too encumbered by the world. So now in this chapter, chapter 6 of third canto, the Supreme Lord is getting around to doing that. He's explaining the Varnashram system. And in this way, people can work in a simple way, and in this way they can overcome material problems, support their bodies, and at the same time do what the real goal of life is, which is to cultivate devotional service. So, as we said, this system of Varna and Ashram is described as, the Brahmanas have 6 occupations. Prabhupada says Patan, Patan, Yajan, Yajan, and Dana and Pratigraha. So Patan and Patan is to learn and teach, or study and teach. So this is what Brahmanas are supposed to do, Patan, Patan. And then they're supposed to Yajan, so they're supposed to worship the Supreme in some form, as the Archa Vigraha or some other form. And then they're supposed to teach others how to do that worship, Yajan. And Dana and Pratigraha means they get donations and they also give out charity. So they do both things. So these are the 6 basic qualifications for a Brahmana. Now, I thought, as an interesting exercise, I would go to Canto 7, to where we talk about the 4 social orders or 4 social classes. So, in the very beginning, Sukadeva Goswami is describing Prahlad Maharaj, and Yudhishthira is asking questions in this case, and Narada explains about certain beings being created, and then he says there are general principles followed by all human beings: truthfulness, mercy, austerity, observing fasts on certain days of the month, bathing twice in a day, tolerance, discrimination between right and wrong, control of the mind and senses, nonviolence, celibacy, charity, reading of scripture, simplicity, satisfaction, rendering service to saintly persons, gradually taking leave of unnecessary engagements, observing the futility of the unnecessary activities of human society, remaining silent, grave, and avoiding unnecessary talk, considering whether one is the body or the soul, distributing food equally to all living entities, that is, both men and animals, seeing every spirit soul, especially in the human form, as part of the Supreme Lord, hearing of the activities and instructions given by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the shelter of the saintly persons, chanting about these activities and instructions, always remembering these activities and instructions, trying to render service, performing worship, offering obeisance, becoming servant, becoming a friend, and surrendering one's whole self. O King Yudhisthira, these 30 qualifications must simply be acquired. O King Yudhisthira, these 30 qualifications must be acquired in the human form of life. Simply by acquiring these qualifications, one can satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So we see there's a mix of mundane duties, good qualities, and at the same time, obviously devotional activities. So all that's there. And this is kind of the preface of it. And, then there is a more elaborate explanation of, the Brahmanas and how they're able to accept charity. And then there's an explanation of the Kshatriyas, as I think Prahladananda Swami mentioned yesterday, that Brahmanas can levy taxes. That's how they get their income, but they don't. What's that? Yeah, right, sorry. Verbal typos. I'm glad somebody's catching these. I had to do a bunch of paste ups on the last one to get some of my verbal typos. I think one thing and I think I'm saying something different. Anyway, right, it's Kshatriyas that need to subsist by levying taxes. And then they can never accept charity. And then the other social orders, the Vaishyas subsist by commerce and by making goods available to people, the necessities of life. So we see how these orders work together, and the Shudras fill in all the empty spots, all the gaps, whatever else needs to be done. The Shudras do that, and they are actually supported by the other classes, the Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas. So the Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras all work together like a body works together. They all have different functions. And one is pigeonholed into one of these classes. According to the modes of nature one has predominantly acquired through his sojourn through this material world. So throughout many lifetimes, some people, after many births, wind up mostly in the mode of goodness, and then they are prone toward a Brahminical kind of occupation. Some people are mostly in the mode of passion, and they're prone more to a Kshatriya role in society. Some are mixed passion and ignorance, and they're prone to being a Vaishya. And those who are more solidly in the mode of ignorance are prone to then acting as Shudras. And this is described in Bhagavad Gita. So the Varna and Ashram system is based on modes of nature. The predominant mode of nature, a particular living entity, has, at this point in his journey through many lifetimes, the mode of nature they've adopted. And of course, this changes over the lifetimes. A person generally may go up for a while, and then may go down for a while, et cetera, et cetera. So, besides this, the four orders, as we've said, in 7th canto, we're hearing from Narada Muni that in emergencies, one can sometimes adopt other occupations. And however, it says one should not serve the Shudras because that's the occupation of a dog. So we've got that, And as Prahladananda Swami was saying yesterday, our present society is mostly not even really run by Kshatriyas, it's run by Vaishyas, and it's run by, actually in one sense, Mudhas, people who have no knowledge of what to do, have no self-control, and have only their own selfish interests at heart. So that's why things are in the perplexing mess that they're in. But if we take a look, we also see that with the four Varnas, there are four ashrams, and we know those as being brahmachari, grihastha, Vanaprastha, and sannyas. So these are 4 orders of life. And these are usually structured according to the time periods in a person's progress through life. Generally, a person starts out as a brahmachari or brahmacharini, and then moves into grihastha life, and then moves into vanaprastha life, and eventually into sannyas. I mean, that's the general order. We see that not everybody follows this pattern. However, what we see here, this is verse 7:12:4. Mekhalajini vasamsi jatadanda kamandalun bibhrad upavitam cha darbapanir yatoditam. So the translation here is, carrying pure kusha grass in his hand, the brahmachari should dress regularly with a belt of straw and with deerskin garments. He should wear matted hair, carry a rod and a water pot, and be decorated with the sacred thread as recommended in Shastras. So, looking around here, I see some of you are slipping. I see a few water pots, but they're not the bona fide type, and no deer skins. Oh, I see, right. Well, what I was thinking is possibly that, the last time you were in India, you didn't manage to get your deer skin from Loy Bazaar, or, we've had some reason people haven't been traveling lately, some kind of disease, or I can't remember what it was, something like that. And this... Right. It's not easy to get. Well, maybe if you go to Liberty Street in Queens, they have the Hindu shops there. You can get your deer skin there. But the reason I point this up, oh, by the way, we're not seeing any dreads either on anybody, I'm afraid, well, that doesn't count because it's not. You haven't used cow dung, which is the appropriate thing to put in the dreadlocks. So that's not bona fide. So by the way, I think wearing dreads, if you actually do use the bona fide means of cow dung, helps you with celibacy, because no lady's going near that. Any rate, the idea here is that the process that we actually follow and why we dress the way we actually dress, where does that actually come from? If what we read, and there's more in this, we find out that, the brahmachari carries firewood, and, he lives in the ashram of the guru, and we find out that, a lot of things, and then we hear about the vanaprastha, eating no grains or anything like that, but subsisting only on fruit, and wearing clothes the color of fire. By the way, that's the concept behind saffron. They're the color of fire, which is to symbolize renunciation. So what's interesting when you read the 7th canto version of Varnashrama Dharma is how this doesn't very much equate with what we actually do. So my question, and I'm going to leave both Prahladananda Swami and Kavya Chandra Swami out of this, I'm going to ask, where does what we actually do then come from? Does anybody know? You're not supposed to answer. Yeah. Yeah, that's partially it. But I thought this was an interesting point because, right now we're hearing a lot of stuff about how, at least by some people, about how absolutely essential Varnashram is. And in one sense it is. But the question is, what Varnashram are we talking about? We are obviously following a modified version of Varnashram. So this is something I think a lot of devotees really don't focus in on, you know. Why do we wear the clothes that we wear and we do the things we do? Well, one of the answers is what, our devotee just said is that, Bhaktisiddhanta, Gopal Champu said that Bhaktisiddhanta reinstituted the brahmachari ashram, and that's true. And that's true. And he instituted, sannyas the way we understand it, not taking the what's generally known as the Babaji Vesh. So we talk about a system, but largely it comes from something called the Pancharatra, the Narada Pancharatra. Now, if you ever study the deity manual, the Pancharatra Pradeep, which explains the proper configuration of activities and the way one should approach the deities and everything, that's when you'll start to read things that sound very familiar, like rising early and cleaning one's body, and we learn about putting on clean clothes, we learn about making a sound before we come into the deity, being punctual, all these kinds of things. And the Narada Pancharatra is what actually really does resemble the system that we really do follow on a day. We're not wearing deer skin, or as a vanaprastha you'd have to wear tree bark. I've never figured out how people wear tree bark, but it must be pretty uncomfortable, But at any rate, the idea is that this is a more reasonable system in our modern day. Now, why was it like that back in the days when Bhagavatam was being spoken and recited? The reason, of course, was that generally, oftentimes, a brahmachari was living in some small, very secluded place with just a handful of people with their guru. And so these things made sense then, But Lord Chaitanya wanted a worldwide movement, and that was, promulgated by the Goswamis, starting with Jiva Goswami, is something called the Vishva Vaishnava Rajya Sabha, which got passed down through the ages and became what we later knew of as the Gaudiya Math, and then later ISKCON. Of course, there's other branches. I'm not suggesting we're the only branch or whatever it is, but the point that I'm making here is that to create a worldwide movement, there needed to be some adjustments. And so part of, our dress and everything comes from Bengali culture, which was the culture that came down from Lord Chaitanya and his associates. And during that time, they wore a certain style and sang a certain type of music, and et cetera, et cetera. And much of our process of devotional service, Prabhupada describes that there are 9 processes of devotional service: Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakyam, Atmini, Videnam. So there are 9 processes, and generally we segue through one and then another, and another, so that we don't get we are not in too much difficulty by doing just the same thing all the time. So sometimes we're hearing, sometimes we're chanting, sometimes we're performing various service, sometimes we're offering prayers or serving on the altar or something like that. So there's a whole smorgasbord of different devotional activities. And so this is how the Narada Pancharatra kind of describes devotional service. Sounds very much like the Hari Bhakti Vilas or the the nectar of devotion, where various activities are described. So we see there's a kind of tradition, and this is a modern tradition. And this is what allows us to do our version of Varnashram Dharma in a practical way in the modern time. And Prabhupada put it in a certain way, and it was handed to him also by his predecessors, so on and so forth. So this is the modern version of Varnashram Dharma, and why we don't, carry kusha grass very often, or have belts of straw, or sit on a deer skin on a kusha mat. Although the other day I noticed that our Natavar Gauranga did in fact have a little mat that did look like a deer skin. It wasn't really, but it kind of looked like that, But at any rate, I want to leave some time for questions and, discussion and corrections and realizations. So, anybody have any questions or comments about what we've discussed up to this point? Okay, well, let's take Kavichandra Swami first.
Hear about it, mostly hear about details or something, but what is the goal of the Varnashram? Isn't that the important?
What's that?
The goal of Varnashram.
Yeah.
What is that? That seems to me that whatever it is.
Right.
Not exactly who's labeled what or who's doing exactly what in a certain way,
That's described in the 7th canto, in I believe it's the 12th chapter. It might be the 13th, but I think it's the 12th chapter, where the goal of it is to meet one's necessities, and at the same time provide a system where one can meet the necessity of spiritual purification. So those are kind of the two things that Varnashram does. It's supposed to do that. If I have some time later today, I'll try to find the exact verse where it kind of delineates that, but I don't remember which one it is just off the top of my head right now. Prahladananda Swami.
One thing that Prabhupada says about the origin of how we dress, he said when we see our devotees, they're dressed in saffron with shaven heads and tilak, and they're dancing, they look like they're coming from Vaikuntha.
Maybe we're wearing the latest Vaikuntha fashion here.
Yes. Krishna, he's described as wearing a dhoti. At least in
this is true hot couture.
Krishna is described as wearing a yellow dhoti, so it looks like in the spiritual, at least in parts of the spiritual world, there are such things as dhotis and courtiers and things like that.
Do what?
The dress we have now seems to the origin is the spiritual world, because Krishna wears a dhoti, saffron and yellow dhoti. And Srimati Radharani has has a variety of saris.
She has what?
Saris.
Chatters.
Saris.
Saris, okay. The reverberation in I have terrible hearing too, so...
Hare Krishna Maharaj, I remember in one of your previous lectures you were stating that nowadays everything is mixed up. You have people who don't have, like in the past you had just Kshatriyas, just Vaishyas, and it was much easier to establish Varnashrama Dharma, and everything was fine and peaceful. And of course and you were basically saying that nowadays we cannot establish it in the same manner as in the past.
We cannot do what?
We cannot establish it today, Varnashrama Dharma, in the same way, but the question is, up to what extent we can establish Varnashrama Dharma because apparently Prabhupada wanted it. And if you can give some idea, something.
So if I understand your question, you're asking to what extent or in what way can we establish Varnashram Dharma?
Yeah, how will it look nowadays?
How would it look nowadays? That's the $60 million question that plagues the minds of many ISKCON leaders. And there are many different answers to it.
I guess you have your own idea, so you can share with us.
Right. Well, it seems like in general, the purpose, as we said, of the Varnashram system is to create a method for people to meet their material needs and prosecute Krishna consciousness at the same time. Prabhupada had a general vision, and we see that, that there would be temples in urban areas, and those temples would make and meet people and make devotees. And then there would be rural farm communities where people could go to do simple living and high thinking, where they could perform agricultural activities, meet their personal necessities for food, shelter, and so on and so forth. And in general, that's kind of an outline, of what at least I think a lot of people would agree upon, that there was that general idea. And of course, in the idea of Varnashram Dharma, I don't think, was it you were saying that the other day, Prahladananda Swami, that we're going to label ourselves, I'm a Vaishya, I'm a, Kshatriya. Was it? Yeah, it's not necessary, right? Right. So we do some activity. All of us will have to somehow maintain ourselves. If we are full-time serving the temple, then the temple will meet our necessities of eating and domicile, But if we're living outside the temple, then we'll have to have some occupation to meet those same necessities. And engage in some kind of preaching activity. So that's what I think we could say as a rough sketch of Varnashram Dharma. When we get down into the weeds and discussing a lot of details, exactly how it's implemented, then I think we would come. There would be some controversies, but in general, the rural life was intended to be fairly simple, so that a person would not have, like living here in New York, you've got laws, you've got all the necessities of living in a big city. In a place like New York City, things cost a lot of money. If you're going to rent somewhere, it's very expensive. If you're going to buy things, it's expensive. If you're going to get around, at least you've got the subway. But, it's complicated, and it can get to the point where a person is really tangled up in various meeting of requirements by the lifestyle and by the nature of the environment that we're in. So that's why living in a rural place is much easier. Provided you're actually raising your own food, but at least most of our farms in North America don't do that. They may raise a small fraction of the food that they actually use, but that was the original idea. Where I see Varnashram has gone off the rails in our movement is the fact that we really have not somehow or other convinced any significant amount of devotees in our movement to be real Vaishyas, to do agriculture in a large-scale way. Of course, in the modern world, to do agriculture in a practical way is practically impossible. The outside world, the powers of commerce, and the financial institutions that we live under have made farming practically a lost cause as far as making money that way. So farmers have to struggle like anything, and then they go under for the most part. Now, if there's a community to support those farmers, then maybe they can, make progress. But the real issue is, a devotee to be a farmer means that they would have to accept what we call poverty level lifestyle and see as this is my dharma. My god brother or god sister may be working, in a cubicle in some office building somewhere. I'm going to make a fraction of what they make. My children are not going to have the same, things that my god brother will, or my god sister who's working 9 to 5 somewhere or another. But this is what we need. We need actual farmers. And so they will have to somehow or another convince themselves to live under those conditions. And so far we haven't seen that in ISKCON. We haven't seen devotees volunteering for that austerity. What to do? I don't know. I don't have an answer. But that's a relevant, I think, Varnashram Dharma consideration. You have anything you'd like to say, Prahladananda Swami or Kavyachanda? Yeah, right. We've opened the door to a thing that they have week seminars about, week-long seminars about. All right, so anyone have any final quick question or realization before we top it off? We've got about a minute left.
Even though now it's not very clear who is in which Varna and everything is very mixed up, still, to which extent by practicing Krishna consciousness can we change our mix of modes of nature that our body is made of?
Positively. Absolutely and positively. We can and should. That's the whole thing, We hear that, one rises above one's material designation. Sarvopadi vinirmuktam tatparatvena nirmalam hrishikena hrishikesha sevanam bhaktiruchate. That by performing devotional service, one rises above. That's why, in one sense, trying to peg devotees as being in a particular varnashram is particularly troublesome, because we're in the process of rising up through the various modes of nature. Whereas people outside of devotion, they may be more or less in one mode of nature and they're not moving very much. And of course you have the fact that you have people like Kolavecha Sridhar, who was intimate disciple of Lord Chaitanya. By occupation he was a Shudra, but he was also on the highest level of devotion. So do we really consider that being a Shudra? Was that? Well, okay, he had banana leaves though, right? That's what he was. Well, okay. I guess, okay, maybe you could say that. But some account people call him a Shudra. Right. All right, yeah, that does make more sense. Yeah.
But you can see obviously the greatest, much greater than so many other Brahmanas.
Please talk into the...
You can see he was so much greater than many other Brahmanas, so he has this great quality. But nevertheless, we can see he was still working as a Vaishya.
Vaishya, right.
Would he be able to work as a Kshatriya or as a Brahmana, teaching the scriptures?
Well, I don't know, but I'm just making the point that since devotional service pulls a person above the upadis, sarvopadi vinirmuktam, since it pulls a person above the upadis, that means that it's really hard to label a devotee as something. And in general, we see that when Prabhupada first came to the United States, he put devotees in all kinds of occupations, many of which were totally unsuited to that occupation. But he put them there anyway. Now, in regular Indian Varnashram Dharma, you would never have done something like that, But in some cases, the devotees, worked it out. Maybe they weren't the best at what they did, but they did something, And in some cases, the devotees somehow or another, like Plato, were able to form themselves into whatever was necessary to achieve that particular thing. So, whereas with regular Varnashram Dharma, I think the kind that Prabhupada wanted to institute, where we're not asking people to become full-on devotees. In such a situation, we would probably see a person is more acclimated toward a Vaishya position, or working as a administrator or something of that nature. I think then we might think in those terms. But that's, the kind of Varnashram Dharma that I would call third circle. In Bhagavad Gita 12th chapter, we have the idea that, Arjuna is speaking to Krishna. Krishna is telling him, just think of me. And that's first circle. But there's hardly anyone in that. That's actually, pure devotion. Then he says, if you can't think of me, then perform the process of devotional service. In this way, you will develop a desire to attain me. That's second circle. People like us who are performing the devotional activities. We are following regulations. We're trying to live a lifestyle based on service for Krishna. Then there's the third circle, which if you can't do that, then serve in some way or another, perform some, like Prabhupada said. Give up the results of your activity. Right. So that's where the third circle comes in, where we don't expect necessarily people are going to follow all four regulative principles or come regularly for Mongol Artik or any of those kind of things. But they're still inclined toward Krishna, and they're doing something to help the overall progress of Krishna consciousness in the world. So that's kind of the way I see it, but we don't have time to really get into it more than that. But anyway, thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord.